Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel AWS DevOps Niche Level. So in this video, the topic that we are going to discuss is AWS VPC endpoint. And we will also be doing a lab demo on the VPC endpoint. And typically the lab demo will be on a gateway endpoint, right? So there are two types of endpoints which we will discuss, but the lab demo will be on the gateway endpoint. So now what do you mean by a VPC endpoint? VPC endpoints provide a secure and private way for resources within your VPC to access the AWS services, typically enhancing the security. So the primary objective of the VPC endpoint is, if at all any resources within your VPC wants to communicate with other AWS services like S3 or a DynamoDB, etc., through a private link, not via the internet, through a private link, then in that case, we can set up a VPC endpoint. And the primary objective of this VPC endpoint is to facilitate that communication using the private link in order to enhance the security and avoiding any exposure to the internet. Now, what are all the two types of VPC endpoints? So we have interface endpoint and there is a gateway endpoint. So what is an interface endpoint? So interface endpoints enable private connectivity to a wide range of supported AWS services through the private link, and the charges will be typically based on the amount of data getting transferred via the interface endpoint, and also there is a hourly charges. Okay? And whenever we create an interface endpoint, basically it will add a separate ENI to the EC2 instance. Right? So let's say we want an EC2 instance to communicate to a different AWS service via the interface endpoint. The moment you create an interface endpoint, there will be a separate elastic network interface that gets added and assigned to the instance. So that is the interface endpoint. Then the second category, what we have is the gateway endpoint. So what is a gateway endpoint? So if at all you want to have your resources within a private subnet, talk to the services, typically S3 and DynamoDB, right? So let's say we have a application server inside a private subnet, and that application server needs to connect to the S3 service or connect to the DynamoDB via the private link. In that case, you go ahead and set up a gateway endpoint, right? So gateway endpoint are mainly specific to these two services, Amazon S3 and DynamoDB, whereas the interface endpoint, it can support or it can communicate with multiple AWS services. But if you have a specific requirement where you need to communicate only with the S3 or a DynamoDB, in that case, you can go ahead and straight away spin up a gateway endpoint. And gateway endpoint, the advantage is that it automatically sets up the routing table entries, whatever is needed for the instance inside a private subnet to talk to the S3 or the DynamoDB service. So the management of the gateway endpoint is comparatively easier to the interface endpoint. Now, let us directly get into the lab demo for the gateway endpoint. So this would be the sequence of steps. First, we need to set up a VPC with public and private subnets. And I already have that. So I already have a VPC created, and I have a public and the private subnet with the associated route tables as well. Then launch a web server in a public subnet and app server in a private subnet. So this is what I'm going to start with. Within my VPC, I'll be launching a web server within a public subnet, and I will be launching an app server inside a private subnet. Then what we will do as a third step, we will be assigning a S3 full access permission to the app server, because I want to communicate to the S3 service from my app server, which is inside a private subnet. So first I need to ensure that the app server has the S3 full access permission. Next, we will create a gateway endpoint. Then we will verify the connectivity from the app server, which is residing in a private subnet, to the S3 service. So these are all the steps that I'm going to do. As I mentioned, the step 1 is already done. So I'm going to start with the step 2, where I will be launching a web server in a public subnet, and I'll be launching an app server in a private subnet. So let me go to my AWS console and I will go into the EC2 dashboard. So let me click launch instance. I will name it as web. I'll go with the Amazon 2023 AMI. T2.micro, that is fine. Let me use one of my existing key pairs. Now network settings, let me click edit and I'll have to put it in my custom VPC, which is my demo VPC that I've already created. Now this is web server, which will be residing in a public subnet. So it's already selected there. And SSH, I'm just going to enable the SSH access only from my IP address. Now let us go ahead and launch the instance. Okay, so I think it has successfully launched the web server. Now let me go ahead and launch the apps. Okay, I'll click launch instances. Name it as app. Okay, the same AMI I will pick up. Instance type t2.micro. I'll pick up the same key pair. Again, under the network settings, let me select my custom VPC. And this is app server, which will be residing in a private subnet, right? So let me select private subnet where we will not have a public IP. So that is disabled. We'll have to communicate only via the private IP. And SSH, I'm going to open the SSH communication only from my public subnet. And the CIDR for my public subnet is 10.0.0.0/27, right? So now let me click launch instance. Okay, now this is our current setup, right? Where I have a VPC here. This is my VPC. And I have a web server, which is inside a public subnet. And I have an app server inside a private subnet. My web server. I would say this is public subnet. And this is my app server, which is inside a private subnet. Okay. And from this app server, I am going to connect to the S3 service via the private link. Right? So let's say this is my S3. This is my S3 bucket. So from this app server inside a private subnet, I want to connect to the S3 service via the private link. Okay, because let's say I want to upload some files securely to the S3 bucket. So I have to definitely talk via the private link. And in order to establish this private link, I need to set up a gateway endpoint. This is what I'm going to do. From the app server inside a private subnet, I want to talk to the securely communicate with the S3 service. So how do we do that? For that, we need to set up a private link, which will be provided by the gateway endpoint. So now what we'll do, I will log into the app server from the web server because we don't have a direct access to the app server since it is inside a private subnet, right? So first, let me log into the web server, grab the public IP. SSH, let me upload my keys. This is my web server, the public subnet. Now I'm going to log in to the app server from the web server. Okay, so what is the private IP of my app server? You can see here we don't have a public IP because it's inside a private subnet. So I'm going to communicate only via the private IP, which is 10.0.0.39. It's asking, or you want to continue connecting? I will say yes. And you can see here we are getting a permission denied error, right? So how do we fix this? Basically, it would need a key forwarding, which we have not done it, right? Whenever you want to connect to the app server from the web server or to a server inside a private subnet, from the server inside a public subnet, you need to do the keys forwarding. You need to forward the keys, right? So we need to do a SSH key forwarding, which is not done in this case, right? So SSH key forwarding has to be done. Okay, so that is what I'm going to do. So how I'm going to forward the keys is, first, I'm using the Pagian utility, which is one of the utility for the key forwarding. So in Pagian, I'm going to add the private key for my web server. Okay. Now let me take a fresh putty session for my web server. Let me copy the public IP. I'll go to SSH auth credentials. I will upload the same private key. Okay, then I will click auth here and I will enable this one. You can see here, allow agent forwarding. Okay, I'm putting a check mark there, right? Then click open and log into the web server. We increase the font size a bit. Okay, now I'm in my web server. From here, I'm going to log into the app server. And what is the IP of the app server? It is 10.0.0.39. Okay, now from this app server, let's say I want to connect to the S3 bucket. Okay, so I will sudo to the root first, and I will give the command AWS S3 ls. So you can see here, first and foremost, it is saying unable to locate the credentials. You can configure the credentials by running AWS configure. Either you can do via that technique, or what we can do is we can directly assign a S3 full access role to this EC2 instance, right? So that is what I'm going to do. What I will do is I will go to the IAM. In IAM, I already have a role created, which is the S3 full access. And I'm going to assign that role directly to my instance in the private subnet, which is the app server. Okay, so let me go to the roles here. And let me search for S3 full access. You can see here, we have this role already available. I have created it already. This is the S3 full access role for EC2. And what is the permission it is having? You can see here, it is having the Amazon S3 full access permission. So this app server will have complete access to the S3 service. So it's important to assign this role to the app server. So how do you assign this role? I select the app server, I go to actions, I go to security, I click modify IAM role, and I will select this role S3 full access for EC2, and then I click update IAM role. So this step is completed where you have assigned the needed permission for your app server to talk to the S3 service. Okay. Now I give the command AWS S3 ls to list the buckets. But now you see, authentication wise, it's good. But again, there is no communication, right? There is no communication link for this EC2 instance to talk to the S3 service. And that is where you need to create a gateway endpoint. So we have set up the authentication, but we have not really set up the private link for the communication to happen, right? So now let me go ahead and create a gateway endpoint. How do we create a gateway endpoint? I will go to my VPC dashboard. Okay, so in the VPC dashboard, if you come to this particular section here, private link and lattice, you can see here private link and lattice, and under that you have endpoints. Can you see this? Endpoints. So I'm going to click that. Let me click endpoints here. So no endpoint found. I'm going to create an endpoint. Let me give it a name, my demo gateway endpoint. Okay. And type, it is the AWS services. It to which entity we need to connect our endpoint to the AWS services, right? So I'm just selecting AWS services, and I'm going to which service I want to connect. For example, in this case, I'm going to connect to the S3 service. So I'm going to select this particular service name, home.amazon AWS AP South 1.S3, because I'm in the Mumbai region, right? I'm going to select a service that is available in the Mumbai region. So let me first select this one. Okay, now you can see it is showing two options here. One is a gateway endpoint, other is an interface endpoint. Okay, I'm going to go with the gateway endpoint, right? So I'm going to create a gateway endpoint because gateway endpoint is very specific to two services, as I told you, S3 and DynamoDB, right? So you can, if you want to connect to any of these two services, you can actually go ahead and spin up a gateway endpoint, and management of gateway endpoint is also quite easier compared to the interface endpoint. So I'm going to select gateway endpoint here, first one, and VPC, to which VPC I need to associate this endpoint, this my custom VPC, right? My demo VPC. And route tables, to which route table I need to associate this endpoint. Definitely it should be a private route table because our app server is residing in a private subnet. So I need to link this endpoint to the private route table. So I'm going to select RT underscore private, right? And we are going to give a full access policy to this endpoint. I leave it to the default, and I will just say create endpoint. So you can see here, it's showing that the gateway endpoint has been created. So let us also check the route tables, because very shortly it is going to add a route table entry directly for your route table for the private subnet. Okay, so if I click manage route tables here, okay, this is my private route table. If I click modify route table, click the route table again. Okay, it has not added the route yet. We will give it some time. It will take some time to add the routes. So the routes will be automatically added by the gateway endpoint. Okay, now let me select it again. I go to the routes, I click edit routes. Okay, great. Now you can see here, this route has been automatically added. So if the destination, you can see here, if the destination is a S3 service, this is actually pointing to the S3 service in the Mumbai region. Okay. So how the communication should go? What is the target? This is your gateway endpoint. Okay. So if the communication has to go to the S3 service from the private subnet, it has to go via the gateway endpoint, which is the private link. Now you can see that this route got added automatically. I didn't add this route. The moment I created the gateway endpoint, this route got automatically added. That is advantage, right, with the gateway endpoint. Okay, now we can try to communicate with our S3 bucket. Now is that we have the private link automatically set up. Okay, now we have this gateway endpoint automatically set up now. In the sense it has automatically added a route. So I'm going to say same command AWS S3 LS. Now you can see we are getting a response at least. Now I'm going to create a bucket from here. So I will say AWS S3 makes bucket S3://. I will say my demo bucket. 12/4/2025. Okay, great. You can see here, we are able to talk to the S3 service. We were able to create a bucket successfully, right? Now, if I give the command again, AWS S3 LS, it is listing me the bucket as well. Now, the communication is going from this app server via the gateway endpoint. Now, the communication is going via this private link. So there is no, worry about the data flowing via the internet because it's all the private link. That's why gateway endpoint is very secure. Okay, now if at all if I want to upload any files onto the bucket, any sensitive files, yes, I can, do via the same communication channel, right? So we can also check whether the bucket is also successfully created. Let me click S3 here. You can see here, this is the bucket that we have created from that instance using the gateway endpoint. Okay, now if I want to upload any files within this bucket, any sensitive files, I can give the AWS S3 copy command from here, right? AWS S3 copy command, and then select any file, whatever I need to upload from my app server to the S3 bucket, right? Now, similarly, I want to remove this bucket, AWS S3 RB, that is remove bucket, S3:// and I give this bucket name. Now, we would be able to remove this bucket. Now, you can see how we were able to talk to the S3 service from this app server inside a private subnet via the gateway endpoint, the private link. Fine. I think this is the demo I just wanted to provide in regard to the gateway endpoint. Okay, so we will review the lab steps. First, you need to set up a VPC with a private or with a public and private subnet. Then I launched a web server in a public subnet, an app server inside a private subnet. And I also showed you how do we assign that full access role to the app server. Then we created a gateway endpoint, which automatically updated the route table entries for the private subnet. And then we were able to check the connectivity from the app server to the S3 service, right? Where we were able to create a bucket. We were able to remove the bucket as well. Okay, so that is a quick use case for the gateway endpoint, which is one of the component under the VPC endpoint. I hope this content was helpful.